Berlin, 1961. The city breathed tension like fog, rolling off the Spree River, thick enough to choke on. Every cobblestone street whispered the possibility of annihilation, every checkpoint a potential spark that could ignite the powder keg of nuclear war. Here, in this divided metropolis carved like a carcass between East and West, two ideologies didn't just compete. They aimed loaded guns at each other's hearts across a concrete scar that split families, lovers, and the soul of humanity itself. American soldiers stood on one side, Soviet troops on the other, separated by mere meters, and an abyss of hatred neither could cross without ending the world. The wall wasn't just concrete and barbed wire. It was the physical manifestation of mankind's capacity for mutual destruction, a monument to fear built brick by brick in the dead of night. The diplomats spoke in careful, measured tones in their secure rooms, but on the streets, young men gripped their rifles tighter with each passing hour. Searchlights swept through, the darkness like accusing fingers, illuminating the no-man's land where grass refused to grow and hope went to die. East Berliners watched from darkened windows, their faces pale ghosts pressed against glass, wondering if tonight would be the night the shooting started and never stopped. This wasn't some distant battlefield on foreign soil. This was the front line of the Cold War, where American GIs could see the whites of Soviet eyes, and both sides understood that hesitation might mean death, but action could mean Armageddon. The air itself seemed electrified, charged with the static of impending violence that could erupt at any second. Checkpoint Charlie stood as ground zero for this apocalyptic standoff, the most fortified 100 meters on Earth. Tank traps lined the streets like steel teeth waiting to bite. Machine gun nests overlooked every approach, and beneath it all ran the current of absolute terror, disguised as military discipline. Every commander knew the mathematics of destruction. One miscalculation, one nervous finger on one trigger, and the missiles would fly from their silos towards cities filled with millions of innocent souls. The world had never stood closer to the edge of the abyss, and in Berlin, you could feel the vertigo of that precipice in your bones. Both superpowers had drawn their line in the ashes of the old world, and neither would blink. Burst, or so Moscow believed, right up until 150 American tanks appeared on the horizon. The M60 Patton emerged from America's industrial heartland like a mechanized answer to Soviet expansion. 52 tons of precision-engineered defiance rolling off assembly lines in Detroit, while Khrushchev pounded his shoe on tables in distant conference rooms. Engineers at Chrysler Defense had studied every weakness exposed in Korea, every vulnerability that left earlier Patton variants burning on frozen hillsides, and transformed those bitter lessons into hardened steel and ruthless efficiency. The tank's hulls stretched nearly 23 feet of welded armor plate, each angle calculated not by artists but by mathematicians who understood that in armored warfare, geometry meant the difference between deflection and penetration. Its silhouette broke from the rounded curves of previous generations, embracing flat planes and sharp angles that made Soviet armor-piercing rounds slide away like rainwater off concrete. The turret housed a 105mm main gun, capable of punching through tank armor at distances where enemy crews couldn't yet see death coming for them. This wasn't just another tank. This was American engineering's middle finger to Moscow's assumptions about Western decadence and industrial weakness. Inside that turret, innovation separated the M60 from everything the Soviets fielded across the Iron Curtain. The fire control system integrated rangefinders and ballistic computers that transformed gunnery from rough artistry into cold science, allowing American crews to engage targets with accuracy Soviet tankers couldn't match even in their optimistic training. Reports: the engine compartment held a Continental diesel power plant generating 750 horsepower, enough raw force to push this steel behemoth across European terrain at 30 miles per hour when doctrine demanded speed, and 20 miles per hour when caution preserved lives. Infrared searchlights and periscopes gave American crews eyes in darkness that turned night into tactical advantage rather than vulnerable blindness. The ammunition storage protected each round in compartments designed to blow outward rather than inward, a detail that meant survival when Soviet philosophy accepted cremation as acceptable loss. Critics in Moscow read the specifications and laughed at American excess, calling it wasteful over-engineering built by a nation that had never truly suffered. They measured Soviet quantity against American quality and chose to believe numbers would overwhelm sophistication when the shooting started. But those Soviet analysts sitting in their Kremlin offices had never felt the ground shake when a company of M60s rolled past in formation, never experienced the psychological weight of facing a weapons system designed by engineers who assumed their crews deserved every possible advantage. The pattern represented something deeper than tactical capability. It embodied a philosophical commitment that American soldiers were worth the extra expense, the additional complexity, the technological edge that might bring them home alive. Every system redundancy, every armor upgrade, every fire control refinement declared that Western democracy valued individual lives enough to invest in their protection. Soviet designers built for mass production and acceptable casualties. American engineers built for crew survival and battlefield dominance. The KGB intelligence officers reviewing reconnaissance photographs saw metal and mechanisms. They failed to perceive the doctrine of deterrence being forged into every weld. That blindness would cost them dearly when ideology collided with reality at a checkpoint in Berlin, where theory faced truth across a concrete barrier and neither side could afford to look away. The M60 pattern became operational just as Berlin transformed from political problem into existential crisis, arriving in European depots like reinforcements, showing up precisely when hope seemed lost and retreat appeared inevitable. American tank commanders trained on these machines understood they weren't driving transportation. They were commanding mobile fortresses designed to stop Soviet armor columns dead in their tracks should Moscow decide checkpoint. Charlie was where the next war would begin. Each tank cost hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time when that money could have built schools or hospitals, but strategists in Washington understood that weakness invited aggression while strength maintained an uneasy peace. The Soviets had numbers. America had the M60 pattern, and in the brutal calculus of armored warfare, quality could counter quantity if deployed with sufficient will and clarity of purpose. That equation was about to be tested in the most dangerous place on Earth, in the windowless briefing rooms beneath Dzerzhinsky Square, where cigarette smoke hung thick as Moscow fog and confidence flowed cheaper than vodka. KGB intelligence officers spread reconnaissance photographs across scarred wooden tables and permitted themselves the luxury of contempt. Major Dmitry Volkov studied the grainy images of the M60 pattern with the dismissive expression of a literature professor examining children's crayon drawings, his finger tracing the angular lines of the American tank's hull, while colleagues leaned close with skeptical smirks. The reports from technical intelligence described the tank's specifications in exhaustive detail. Armor, thickness, gun calibration, engine output. But these men had spent careers learning that Western decadence inevitably produced expensive failures wrapped in technological pretension. They saw complexity where Soviet design embraced elegant simplicity, witnessed over-engineering where Russian pragmatism demanded reliable brutality, and their analysis reflected the ideological certainty that capitalism's contradictions would always betray its weapons systems when history's inevitable march demanded blood and steel. Senior analysts drafted assessments that traveled upward through military hierarchies, like prayers ascending to distant gods, each evaluation reinforcing predetermined conclusions, rather than challenging comfortable assumptions about Soviet superiority. Colonel Yuri Petrov wrote with particular confidence that the M60's sophisticated fire control systems would fail in combat conditions, that American crews lacked the fighting spirit forged through genuine suffering, that one T-55 was worth 3 of these overcomplicated Western machines because Soviet tankers understood sacrifice, while Americans understood only comfort. The ballistic computer seemed laughable to men whose armor had crushed fascism through raw determination rather than technological advantage, and they calculated that mechanical complexity meant more components to malfunction when Berlin's cold, autumn rain turned battlefields into frozen proving grounds. Their reports never questioned whether Moscow's assessment might be clouded by wishful thinking or whether underestimating American resolve had ever proven strategically disastrous in previous confrontations where certainty met reality. Training officers in East German tank divisions received these evaluations and passed dismissive jokes through their ranks like ammunition, teaching their crews that American tankers were soft, their machines unreliable, their will to fight non-existent when faced with true revolutionary commitment. They told stories in mess halls about how Soviet engineering had defeated Hitler's best designs through simplicity and numbers, conveniently forgetting that American industrial might had provided the trucks and steel that made that victory possible. The condescension became doctrine, repeated so often in classified briefings and training sessions that it transformed from hopeful theory into accepted fact, creating a dangerous blindness that mistook propaganda for intelligence. These officers stared at photographs of the M60 pattern and saw confirmation of what they wanted to believe rather than evidence of what they needed to fear. But photographs captured only metal and mechanisms, never the doctrine or determination that transformed machines into strategic realities capable of redrawing the boundaries between peace and annihilation. The Soviet analysts filing their dismissive reports had built their entire assessment on the assumption that American democracy bred weakness, that comfort corroded fighting spirit, that their ideological superiority would manifest as battlefield dominance when the moment of confrontation finally arrived. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong certainty could be when 150 of these supposedly inferior machines rolled toward Checkpoint Charlie with loaded guns and commanders who had no intention of retreating. The mockery was about to die in the face of American steel. Checkpoint Charlie existed as something more than a border crossing. It was the geographical manifestation of incompatible realities, a narrow corridor where two philosophies stood close enough to smell each other's cigarettes and count each other's heartbeats, while the entire world held its breath. The wooden guard shack, painted in American white, stood 90 meters from its Soviet counterpart, separated by cobblestones that had survived Hitler's fall only to become the potential birthplace of something infinitely worse. Diplomats had been arguing for weeks over access rights and sovereignty questions that seemed trivial until men with loaded weapons began interpreting abstract principles as concrete commands, transforming philosophical disagreements into tactical situations where miscalculation measured itself in body counts rather than negotiating positions. The autumn air carried the smell of diesel exhaust and anxious sweat, while searchlights swept the crossing point with mechanical precision, painting everything in harsh whites and impenetrable shadows that made every movement seem threatening, every gesture potentially catastrophic. The crisis ignited over something absurdly simple, whether Allied personnel needed to show identification to East German guards or only to Soviet officers. But simplicity had never prevented wars, only disguised their deeper causes beneath surface disputes. About procedure and protocol, American diplomat Alan Leitner refused to present his credentials to East German authorities on principle, asserting that only Soviet officials possessed legitimate authority in occupied territory, while East German guards insisted on their sovereign right to control their own borders, regardless of what occupation. Agreements written 16 years earlier might have specified. The standoff began as bureaucratic stubbornness, but metastasized into something darker when both sides refused to yield, each recognizing that retreat on this narrow street meant broader concessions across every contested boundary where east faced west. Tanks were summoned not because anyone wanted war, but because neither side could afford to appear weak when weakness invited aggression and aggression invited annihilation. Within hours, the crossing point transformed into a military confrontation that made generals in Washington and Moscow reach for telephones with trembling hands, suddenly aware that decisions made in anger at a Berlin checkpoint could cascade into strategic exchanges that left cities burning and civilizations extinct. Soviet commanders positioned their tanks with deliberate visibility, hull down behind concrete barriers with main guns trained on the American sector, sending unmistakable messages about resolve and consequence. American officers watched through binoculars and calculated fields of fire, recognizing that Soviet gunners were doing identical mathematics from the opposite direction, both groups trapped in a deadly geometry where angles and distances translated directly into survival odds. The diplomatic channels that normally diffused such confrontations had gone cold, leaving military commanders to navigate crises that required political wisdom nobody had bothered to provide. The world discovered that ideology made poor armor when measured against high-velocity projectiles, and that certainty about moral superiority offered no protection against the fundamental mathematics of modern warfare, where everyone loses simultaneously. Checkpoint Charlie had become the place where the Cold War threatened to turn hot, where abstract tensions about political systems and economic theories condensed into the terrifyingly concrete question of who would fire first and whether anyone would survive to regret the answer. The telephone call from Washington arrived at 3:47 in the morning Berlin time, dragging General Bruce Clark from uneasy sleep into a crisis that had metastasized beyond diplomatic containment while darkness still covered the divided city. His aide's voice carried that particular strain of controlled panic that separated routine emergencies from civilization-ending decisions, explaining that Moscow had rejected the latest compromise proposal, and Soviet tanks now sat with engines running and main guns loaded at Checkpoint Charlie, waiting for orders that might never distinguish between demonstration and destruction. Clark dressed in silence, his hands performing familiar movements with mechanical precision, while his mind calculated response options that all seemed to end in variations of catastrophe, recognizing that inaction meant surrender, while action meant gambling millions of lives on assumptions about Soviet intentions that intelligence reports contradicted every 6 hours. The secure line to Washington remained open on his desk, a technological umbilical cord connecting his small office to command centers, where men with better information, but worse perspectives, would second-guess whatever decisions the next hours demanded. The operational order Clark drafted specified overwhelming force deployed with maximum visibility, a steel telegram written in diesel exhaust and armor plate that Moscow's leadership would comprehend regardless of translation difficulties or ideological filters. He requested every available M60 Patton tank within operational range of Berlin, not the modest detachment that normal deterrence required, but a concentration of armor that would transform city streets into corridors of American resolve, impossible to dismiss as bluffing or theatrical posturing. His staff officers exchanged glances that questioned the sanity of moving battalion-strength armor through civilian neighborhoods toward a confrontation point where Soviet gunners had already calculated firing solutions, but nobody voiced objections because everyone recognized that half measures would be interpreted as weakness, and weakness invited exactly the aggression they sought to prevent. Clark signed the deployment order with steady hands, despite understanding that his signature might be the last administrative act before conventional warfare erupted in the heart of Europe. Across West Berlin's American sector, tank commanders received alert notifications that shattered whatever illusions of normal garrison duty their posting might have suggested, transforming routine maintenance schedules into combat preparations conducted with grim efficiency. Sergeants who had been drinking coffee and complaining about the cold now supervised ammunition loading and systems checks, with the focused intensity of men who recognized that peacetime complacency had expired without warning or ceremony. Tank crews climbed into their steel coffins. Nobody used that phrase aloud, but everyone thought it, and began pre-combat rituals that religion and superstition had refined across generations of soldiers facing mortality with insufficient preparation. The M60s coughed to life in sequence, their Continental diesel engines producing a thunder that rolled through residential streets and announced to every civilian within hearing distance that the Cold War had suddenly heated beyond comfortable temperatures. The column began moving before dawn, 150 tanks, rolling toward Checkpoint Charlie in a display of armored power that West Berlin had never witnessed and prayed would never see again. Their treads chewed cobblestones that had survived 2 world wars, creating a mechanical symphony of squealing steel and roaring engines that drowned out everything except the pounding heartbeats of men, riding toward a confrontation that nuclear doctrine had promised would never actually occur. Civilians emerged onto balconies despite the hour, watching the procession with expressions mixing pride and terror, understanding that these tanks represented either their salvation or the herald of their annihilation, depending on decisions being made in Moscow. By men who had never walked these streets, the column advanced with deliberate speed toward the crossing point where Soviet tanks waited, closing the distance between peace and extinction, one measured kilometer at a time, while the world slept unaware that dawn might arrive wearing mushroom clouds instead of ordinary sunlight. The pre-dawn darkness fractured under streetlights that transformed the advancing column into something between military operation and fever dream. 150 M60 Patton tanks flowing through West Berlin's arteries like iron corpuscles, responding to a wound that threatened the entire body's survival. Their headlights carved tunnels through morning fog, illuminating storefronts and apartment buildings that suddenly appeared fragile as cardboard against 50-ton machines designed to penetrate Soviet armor at 2,000 meters. Diesel exhaust hung in the cold air, creating a chemical fog that residents would taste for days afterward, a metallic reminder that their city existed at the precise intersection where ideologies transformed into physics and diplomacy surrendered to kinetic energy. Tank commanders rode with hatches open despite the cold, needing to see obstacles that periscopes reduced to abstract geometry, their faces exposed to wind that carried both freezing rain and the weight of historical consequence. The mechanical thunder announced their passage blocks in advance, giving civilians time to reach windows and doorways where they stood watching America's answer to Soviet provocation roll past with inexorable momentum. Some observers waved small flags, while others simply stared with expressions suggesting they were witnessing either their salvation or funeral, a procession, and lacked sufficient information to determine which. Inside the lead tank, Lieutenant Morrison pressed his face against rubber optics that reduced the world to narrow fields of vision, bisected by reticles designed for killing, his breath fogging the glass despite ventilation systems laboring against the cold. His crew maintained Communication through intercom chatter that mixed coordinates with nervous humor, men using jokes as armor against fears that proper military bearing forbade them from acknowledging directly. The loader kept running inventory checks on ammunition. They all prayed would remain unfired, handling shells with reverence appropriate to artifacts that could either preserve peace or obliterate it depending on whether they stayed racked or entered the breach. Morrison could feel his gunner's tension transmitted through the turret's cramped space, recognizing in peripheral vision the minute adjustments that kept the main gun stable despite the chassis rocking over uneven pavement. They had trained for Soviet encounters in theoretical exercises where mistakes meant embarrassment rather than incineration, but theory was evaporating with each meter closer to Checkpoint Charlie, where enemy tanks waited with intentions that intelligence reports couldn't clarify. The radio crackled with position updates from trailing units, creating an electronic soundtrack that confirmed they weren't advancing alone into whatever waited ahead. The column reached Friedrichstrasse as dawn began diluting darkness into grey twilight that rendered everything colourless and strange, the tanks slowing to parade speed that maximised visibility and psychological impact over tactical efficiency. Berliners now lined both sides of the street despite the hour, thousands of civilians drawn by the engine noise into witnessing history whose outcome remained unwritten and terrifying. Some threw flowers that disappeared under treads without ceremony, gestures of gratitude or desperation that the armor consumed without acknowledgement. Others wept openly, recognizing that these tanks represented the boundary between continued existence and nuclear fire, a thin steel line separating their morning routines from vaporization. Morrison saw an elderly woman making the sign of the cross as his tank passed, her lips moving in prayer that transcended whatever denominational differences might separate American and Protestants from German Catholics, the weight of their hope pressed against his chest more heavily than the flak vest, understanding that failure here meant betraying not just military objectives, but these civilians who had already survived one dictatorship and now watched democracy deploy its heavy armor against another. Checkpoint Charlie emerged through the thinning darkness like a stage set designed by paranoid architects, concrete barriers and guard towers framing the narrow corridor where east met west, and both sides had calculated that the other would blink first. Morrison's tank crested the final rise, and suddenly Soviet T-55s filled his optics, their guns already traversed toward American positions in postures suggesting either reception committee or firing squad. His heart performed gymnastics that training had promised would never actually occur during real confrontations, the animal brain recognizing predators while the military brain began calculating penetration angles and ammunition selection. The column deployed from march formation into combat spacing with practiced efficiency that disguised the terror fueling every movement, 150 tanks transforming a city intersection into an armored showroom, displaying exactly how much steel America would commit to principles that seemed abstract until enemy guns provided concrete context. Morrison keyed his radio and reported position established, 2 words that meant his crew now occupied ground zero for whatever came next, whether that proved to be diplomatic resolution or the opening seconds of humanity's final war. The distance separating American and Soviet gun barrels measured less than 100 meters, close enough that Morrison could distinguish individual rivets on enemy turrets through optics designed for targets measured in kilometers rather than stone throws. His gunner breathed in shallow rhythms that fogged the cramped turret interior, right hand resting on controls that could send a sabot round through Soviet armor before their crew registered the muzzle. Flash. Time adopted the strange elasticity that fear produces, seconds stretching into epochs, while simultaneously collapsing into instants where Morrison found himself unable to remember if he'd been staring at that particular T-55 for minutes or hours. The Soviet commander was visible in his hatch, close enough that Morrison could see. The man wasn't some propaganda poster villain, but simply another soldier who probably had photographs in his breast pocket and parents who wanted him home alive. Radio traffic reduced to terse position confirmations. Every transmission clipped short because excess words felt dangerous, as if conversation itself might trigger vibrations that would tip the situation from standoff into slaughter. Behind Morrison's tank, 149 other crews maintained identical vigils, creating a geometry of mutual destruction where every gun faced another gun in calculations that transformed human beings into components of a vast death equation. The air tasted like diesel and fierce sweat and metal oxidizing in cold moisture, flavors that Morrison knew would define this moment in memory, regardless of whether he survived to remember it. Soviet tank crews made small movements visible through morning light now fully arrived, adjustments that could mean nothing or everything, depending on interpretation that had no margin for error. Morrison watched an enemy gunner traverse his weapon perhaps 2 degrees, a motion that might represent barrel droop compensation or final targeting before firing. Impossible to distinguish until consequences made intentions retroactively clear. His own crew waited for orders that communications discipline prevented them from requesting, trained. Responses warring with survival instincts that screamed for action or retreat, but definitely not this paralyzed exposure. The loader had gone completely silent, his usual nervous chatter exhausted, leaving only breathing sounds and the tick of cooling metal as their engine idled. Morrison's thumb hovered over the radio transmit button repeatedly, rehearsing what words he would use if Soviet guns elevated or if he saw muzzle flash, trying to compose his final report in advance so shock wouldn't steal his ability to warn others. Through peripheral vision, he caught sunlight reflecting off binoculars in a guard tower, someone documenting this confrontation for archives that would either record diplomacy's triumph or catalogue the last photographs before escalation made photography irrelevant. The weight of those watching eyes pressed against him from all directions, commanders and civilians and historians not yet born, everyone waiting to learn whether this intersection would host resolution or detonation. Hours accumulated without obvious transition, morning becoming afternoon, becoming a timeless suspension, where bodily needs became abstract concepts that discipline overruled, despite bladders protesting and stomachs cramping from adrenaline that had nowhere productive to discharge. Morrison's eyes burned from refusing to blink during long stretches, irrational conviction emerging that Soviet guns would fire during whatever fraction second. His vision went dark. Reports filtered through command channels describing similar standoffs at other wall positions, confirming this wasn't isolated theater, but coordinated confrontation stretching across the entire border where 2 ideologies had finally run out of earth to separate them. Some American tanks had been staring down Soviet armor for 6 hours now, crews existing in sustained crisis that human nervous systems weren't designed to endure without breaking. Morrison felt his hands trembling and couldn't determine if the shaking came from cold or fear or simple muscular exhaustion from gripping controls with survival-driven intensity. His gunner whispered something that might have been prayer or profanity, the words too quiet for Morrison to distinguish, but the tone conveying everything necessary about their shared predicament. Then movement registered in Morrison's optics, the Soviet tank directly opposite beginning to reverse, its commander apparently receiving orders that broke the paralysis into action whose meaning remained uncertain until the withdrawal continued beyond immediate tactical repositioning. Other Soviet tanks followed in sequence, pulling back from the confrontation line while maintaining weapons orientation, retreat conducted with enough discipline to preserve pride. While acknowledging the futility of mutual annihilation over a checkpoint neither side could actually abandon. Morrison felt something release in his chest, pressure he hadn't consciously registered until its absence allowed full breathing to resume. the exhalation carrying hours of accumulated terror into air that suddenly seemed less likely to ignite. His crew remained silent as they watched Soviet armor recede into East Berlin's maze, understanding without discussion that this represented not victory, but survival. A distinction that felt more precious than any triumph could have provided, given the alternative they'd just avoided. Staff Sergeant William Chen remembered the taste of cold, coffee and copper fear, flavor combinations that defined those days, living inside 60 tons of steel, parked at the edge of apocalypse. His crew existed in rotating states of exhaustion and terror, sleeping in shifts that never exceeded 2 hours because someone always needed to monitor Soviet movements across the wall that divided not just a city, but entire philosophies of human existence. The M-60's interior became their universe, cramped spaces smelling of gun oil and unwashed bodies, and the peculiar metallic tang that fear sweat produces when men realize their protective armor might also serve as their coffin. Chen's loader, a farm kid from Iowa named Patterson, developed a nervous habit of counting rivets on the interior hull, his lips moving soundlessly through numbers that provided psychological anchor against the disorientation of perpetual crisis. Their gunner refused to speak about his wife's recent letter describing their newborn daughter, the words apparently too precious or too painful to share with men who might not survive to meet the child whose photograph he'd taped beside his targeting scope. Radio discipline meant conversations occurred in whispers when they happened at all, every crew member aware that Soviet listening posts were cataloguing their voices and trying to assess American morale from intercepted fragments. The outside world continued, somewhere beyond their viewports. But Chen's reality contracted to instruments and ammunition, and the Soviet tank, whose silhouette had burned itself into his vision, like a photographic negative that persisted even when he closed his eyes. Lieutenant Morrison visited each tank crew during the standoff's second night, moving between vehicles in darkness that provided cover from Soviet snipers, but not from the existential dread that accumulated in sealed turrets. He found Chen's crew maintaining their vigil with the hollow-eyed determination of men who'd passed beyond normal fear into some stranger country where terror became simply another operating condition. Morrison asked about ammunition status and mechanical readiness, practical questions that everyone understood, served primarily to confirm these soldiers remained functional rather than broken by psychological pressures that peacetime training never adequately simulated. Chen responded with reports that emerged automatic from muscle memory, his conscious mind occupied with calculations about wind speed and target distance, and whether his parents would receive accurate information about how he died if orders came to fire. The lieutenant's hand rested briefly on Chen's shoulder before moving to the next position. That momentary human contact carrying more meaning than any speech could have conveyed about shared burden and mutual dependence. When Morrison departed into darkness that swallowed his silhouette within 3 steps, Chen felt the weight of command settle more heavily, understanding that officers carried not just their own fear, but responsibility for every crew they'd positioned at this flashpoint. Patterson resumed counting rivets, his whispered numbers providing rhythm to hours that refused to resolve into either combat or safety. The third day brought Berlin rain that drummed against armor plating and reduced visibility to grey curtains through which Soviet positions appeared as darker shadows in a landscape of uncertainty. Chen's crew existed in damp chill that penetrated. Despite the engine's residual heat, moisture condensing on metal surfaces and dripping onto men who'd long since stopped noticing minor discomforts amid larger terrors. Their radio crackled with traffic describing Soviet tank movements at other checkpoints. Each report analyzed obsessively for patterns that might predict whether this confrontation would escalate or dissolve. Chen watched rain streaming down his viewport and thought about Iowa fields, where Patterson's family probably worried about weather's impact on harvest, rather than whether their son would die defending a checkpoint in a city half of them couldn't locate on maps. The gunner cleaned his scope for the 100th time, repetitive motion, serving no practical purpose, but providing ritual that kept hands busy and minds focused on controllable tasks. Hours dissolved into each other without meaningful distinction, time marked only by shift changes and the gradual accumulation of exhaustion that made every decision feel weighted with consequences beyond individual survival. When orders finally came through that Soviet tanks were withdrawing, Chen felt not triumph, but simply profound relief that this particular nightmare was ending, though he understood the larger confrontation would continue indefinitely across barriers that divided Europe and ideologies that permitted no reconciliation. The Soviet withdrawal began not with dramatic pronouncements, but with engine sounds changing pitch across the concrete wasteland of Checkpoint Charlie, a mechanical symphony that American crews initially mistrusted as tactical repositioning rather than genuine retreat. Chen watched through rain-streaked viewports as the T-55 that had occupied his crosshairs for 72 hours lurched backward in movements that seemed almost reluctant, its commander visible for brief seconds before the turret hatch sealed and the beast disappeared into East Berlin's grey morning. Radio traffic exploded with confirmations from observation posts reporting similar movements at every confrontation point. Soviet armor withdrawing in coordinated fashion that suggested orders from the highest levels of command. Patterson stopped counting rivets mid-number and looked at Chen with an expression mixing disbelief and cautious hope, neither man willing to voice relief until confirmation came through official channels that this wasn't merely prelude to some larger assault. Major Harrison's voice crackled through their radio 20 minutes later with words that carried weight of decisions made in Moscow by men who'd blinked first in this apocalyptic staring contest. Soviet forces were standing down across all Berlin checkpoints, withdrawing their tanks to positions beyond immediate confrontation range, conceding this particular test of resolve to American determination and 60-ton arguments they could no longer dismiss with ideological contempt. Chen felt tension draining from muscles that had maintained combat readiness so long he'd forgotten how relaxation felt, the sensation almost painful as his body remembered it wasn't required to prepare for instantaneous violence. Their gunner pulled his daughter's photograph from beside the targeting scope and pressed it against his chest with both hands, shoulders shaking with sobs he'd suppressed through days of enforced stoicism. Harrison's orders kept them in position, pending further developments, but everyone understood the crisis had passed, that American steel had called a bluff the Soviets discovered they couldn't match. The aftermath arrived in increments rather than sudden transformation. Hours passing before higher command authorized crews to rotate out of their tanks for the first time since deployment. Chen emerged into Berlin daylight that seemed impossibly bright. After days viewing the world through armored viewports, his legs unsteady on pavement as blood flow resumed to extremities numbed by cramped positions. Other crews appeared from their vehicles looking similarly disoriented, men blinking against autumn sun and breathing air not recycled through steel chambers. They didn't celebrate or congratulate each other, exhaustion and lingering dread precluding triumph. But Chen saw in their faces recognition of shared survival and grudging respect for Soviet tankers who'd also stared into that same abyss. Coffee arrived from field kitchens, hot and bitter and tasting of normalcy, returning to spaces recently occupied by existential terror. Word filtered through unofficial channels that Soviet officers had withdrawn with damaged pride, their previous dismissals of American capability contradicted by this confrontation's resolution. The M60 pattern had proven itself not through combat, but through sheer presence, its deployment communicating resolve that words and diplomatic protests could never convey across ideological divides. Chen understood they'd participated in something larger than tactical victory, a moment when Western determination faced Soviet expansion and refused to yield the centimeters that might have encouraged further encroachment. The wall would remain, dividing Berlin for decades yet to come, but the myth of inevitable Soviet dominance had fractured at this checkpoint where 150 American tanks had written doctrine in diesel exhaust and unwavering gun barrels. The confrontation at checkpoint Charlie crystallized into doctrine before the tank engines had fully cooled. Strategists in Pentagon briefing rooms already analyzing how 60-ton machines had accomplished what diplomatic cables and presidential warnings could not achieve against Soviet ambitions. Chen returned to Fort Hood 3 months later, carrying memories of rain-streaked viewports and faces staring across ideological chasms, finding himself invited to tactical seminars where colonels and generals dissected every element of the deployment as though studying sacred texts. The M60 Patton transcended its role as mere weapons platform to become symbol of deterrence theory made manifest, proof that credible force positioned with unwavering resolve could prevent wars rather than provoke them. Photographs of American tanks facing Soviet armor across Berlin's divided spaces appeared in military academies worldwide, visual shorthand for the delicate calculus of Cold War brinkmanship, where perception often mattered more than actual capability. Western military doctrine absorbed lessons from those October days when nuclear annihilation hung on decisions made by exhausted men inside steel boxes, developing strategies that emphasized visible strength and unambiguous commitment to defensive positions. Chen watched the M60 become backbone of NATO armor deployments throughout Europe, hundreds more rolling off production lines to garrison the frontier between competing systems, each tank representing promise that Soviet expansion would meet concrete resistance. The psychology of the standoff influenced everything from force positioning to crew training, with emphasis on soldiers capable of maintaining discipline and composure during confrontations where single mistakes carried apocalyptic consequences. Soviet planners, meanwhile, quietly upgraded their own armor and revised tactical assessments that had too casually dismissed American resolve as capitalist weakness, unequal to communist conviction. Patterson visited Chen years later when both had retired from active service. 2 old tankers sharing bourbon and silence in Houston's suburban darkness. The wall still standing, but the memory of facing it together forming permanent bond. They'd been young men inside those turrets, playing their assigned roles in civilizational chess match where pawns never understood the complete board, yet somehow their presence had mattered in calculations made by distant powers. The M60 Patton eventually gave way to more advanced systems as technology progressed and threats evolved. But for those who'd stared down Soviet guns across Checkpoint Charlie, it remained the tank that stood when standing meant everything. Berlin's wall would eventually fall, torn down by hands demanding freedom, but deterrence had held through decades because once, on cold October pavement, American steel refused to retreat. The legacy persisted in military theory and historical analysis, textbooks citing the Berlin tank standoff as defining moment when Western determination established boundaries Soviet expansion could not cross without risking everything. Chen understood before he died that they'd been fortunate, that circumstances and leadership had pulled both sides back from precipices. They'd approached with terrifying casualness, but fortune favored those prepared to enforce their positions with credible force. The M60 Patton's greatest victory remained the war it never fought, the shots never fired, the apocalypse averted through presence and resolve. Deterrence doctrine born at that checkpoint shaped Cold War's remainder. Peace maintained through strength that adversaries couldn't dismiss or ignore, written in tank tracks on Berlin pavement and carried forward by every crew that followed. What moment in history do you think came closest to changing everything? Subscribe to explore the stories that shaped our world, from the edge of catastrophe